You can feel free to read along with me. Think for a moment about a time when you were awake before dawn. There comes a moment when you notice that the earth is becoming gray, not just dark. Birds begin to sing and animals start to stir as the night begins to lift and the light becomes brighter. Finally, the sun peeks over the horizon and day has begun. While we may record the times of sunrise and sunset in almanacs as the official moments at which day and night change, the actual process of day becoming night, becoming day is much more natural. It is gradual and peaceful. On a beach, the waves ride up over the land in continual motion. Some of the water returns to the sea immediately, while some of it percolates down through the wet sand. The land slopes down from the beach into the sea, forming a liminal zone before dropping further to the sea floor. There are places with cloudy water because of the particulates of sand and salt floating up from the earth's surface to be suspended in the water. While land and sea mark the extremes, they come together on the beach, coexisting in the shore zone. The gradient of variety in Sabiatanis's description of the natural world fills me with awe. Truly, what distinguishes dawn from day and dusk from night? One moment from another moment. What distinguishes the land from the sea, one place from another place? Despite the ambiguity of boundaries, it is, of course, practical to differentiate between things. As human beings, we continuously orient ourselves in space and time. In order to construct our societies, our routines, our ways of being, we make distinctions between this moment and that moment, between this place and that place. We make such distinctions to ease our movement through a day, a month, a year, to organize our lives so that we can go on with living. Last Wednesday morning is different than this Sunday morning. That space at work is different from this space at home. However, after 14 months of pandemic shutdowns, for many of us, such distinctions between days and spaces are turned around, even farcical. If I let myself really pause to think about how fragile my constructions of time and space are, and to what extent the routines and distinctions I depend on have unraveled or even collapsed throughout this long year, I feel anxiety rising and simmering. So much seems to depend on my limited capacity to maintain a clear orientation in any given moment. However, queer and critical race theorist Sarah Ahmed reminds us that in order to become oriented, we must first experience disorientation. Ahmed underscores that orientation, constructing time and space to make sense of our existence, is in direct response to the inevitable experience of disorientation. Religious scholar and Christian theologian Rudolf Otto describes the holy as inherently disorienting, as mysterium tremendum fascinans, an encounter with something that is mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, with something beyond complete comprehension, terrifying, yet alluring, that compels us forward. That is utterly disorienting. But far from protecting ourselves from such disorientation, Otto encourages us to welcome it in. Now, whether or not any one of us shares Otto's description of the holy, I value his invitation to lean in, to creatively respond to, and to be transformed by our disorienting encounters. Last year, the uprising following the murder of George Floyd was significantly disorienting. As I imagine some of you do, I viscerally remember the smell of tear gas in my backyard, the blast of bullets, the ominous presence of military caravans. The uprising also opened up questions about my relationships. Do I really know my neighbors? In what ways do I differ from my family members? Who really are my colleagues and comrades? Who really am I? A few of the youth I work with reached out to me in their own anger, grief, and confusion. They asked in a variety of ways, to what and to whom ought they turn to in the face of such disorientation? In the face of a dissolving social order that is also being forcefully maintained, who are they supposed to be? Of course, these questions expose a kind of white privilege. Not that being aware of police violence and Black racism was new, but the proximity to it was new. For many of us, for me, the proximity to a person's horrific death, to the outpouring of grief and rage, to the violence and power of authorities increased the intensity for me, and I imagine for some of you too. Almost a year now from Floyd's death, and just weeks after the conviction of Chauvin, I pause to reflect on the ways we, as communities and people, have already reoriented ourselves. How do we continue the work of deliberately shaping time, space, relationships, and ourselves differently? How do we grow our capacity to do this work of reorienting ourselves towards what we yearn for, what we can envision this world to be? Local activist and healer Susan Raffo describes how cell membranes function and what we, made up of trillions of cells, might learn from their wisdom. Without the membrane, there would be no way to group molecules together. There would be no body. There would be no form. Raffo writes, the cellular membrane is the boundary that keeps everything that doesn't belong, harmful or wrong or just plain confusing, on the other side. It releases the waste and it lets nourishment in. In addition to providing this malleable structure and the ability to protect the cell, Raffo tells us the cellular membrane is there to learn, which means to grow. This is, after all, why life exists, to experience itself. As life experiences itself, it learns. And here is the quandary, she tells us. The cell cannot grow and protect at the same time. She goes on to describe that to grow is life, and when we need to protect, it is supposed to be temporary until the danger is past. Once the danger is past, we grow again. This, she tells us, is called wisdom. In Raffo's description, there is intelligence, beauty, and warning. If the membrane becomes a wall, blocking off the cell's process of opening and closing and opening, of being in relationship, of learning and growing, of receiving oxygen, if it blocks off this process, the cell cannot breathe and the cell will die. Right here in the simple, intelligent construction of our cells is the deep attention of being distinct but not separate. Having the capacity to differentiate and protect ourselves, and also the capacity to extend, grow, and learn from each other, our experiences, the latter of which brings forth new life. To underscore this non-dualistic truth, Paul Knitter reflects on the Buddhist koan. Emptiness is form, and form is emptiness. He writes, the transcendent abstract reality of emptiness is found in and gives expression to every concrete form in the world, people, animals, plants, events. You can't have all these individual forms without emptiness, but you also can't have emptiness without these individual forms. Knitter highlights the truth that form and emptiness are distinct from one another, yet so thoroughly dependent on each other, neither exists without the other one. In other words, we aren't one in the sense that our distinct forms, our differences are just illusions, just made up. No, we are simultaneously both multiple and one, both uniquely different and utterly connected, all the way down to ourselves and all the way up to the interconnected web of all existence of which we are a part. As exemplified in our reading, other natural phenomena are made up of gradients, the many spaces between land and sea, the many moments between night and day. Despite each moment and space being utterly unique, each moment and space extends into and becomes the next. A firm boundary between two things is only a temporary construction used for a specific purpose, like gathering data or establishing a routine. Temporarily useful, but ultimately movable, changing, porous. I want to invite you to pause with me for a moment and enter into a kind of exercise. You can do it just inside your mind or with your body if you would like. So I'm inviting you to think about a posture of protection, a posture that you make to protect yourself. And if you're willing and able, that posture of protection you are imagining, you can make it now. And in this imagined or physical posture of protection, take 3 breaths. And while you're breathing, notice where you are constricted and where you feel spacious. Slowly release this posture and allow your thoughts to come back to our gathering. And now I invite you to think about or imagine a posture of growth, a posture that you make when you learn. And if you're willing and able, I invite you to make that posture of growth, of learning now. And in your imagined or physical posture, take 3 breaths, noticing where you are constricted and where you feel spacious. Slowly release this posture and allow your thoughts to come back to our gathering. Was your protection posture and your growth posture in tension with one another? In relationship with one another? Were you able to breathe deeply in either or both postures? What was the quality of your breath? And now when you hear the words, we can't protect and grow at the same time, what arises in you? What do you notice? There are really good reasons we protect ourselves. When we live in a reality where the people we know best and love and trust are the people who are most likely to abuse us. When we live in a reality that regardless of our actions, our skin pigmentation is the determining factor to what extent we are experienced as a threat. When we live in a reality when our immediate health and well-being is directly dependent on the actions of strangers. It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to cling to the structures that support us. It makes sense to want to enforce them, to construct walls around ourselves, our personal relationships, our communities, our borders. Protection can absolutely mean survival. But to chronically protect ourselves is to cut off growth, to cut off oxygen, to cut off life. To cling to our protections indefinitely is to die. Which is another injustice to add to the long list, right? The reality that the most vulnerable need the most ongoing protection. How indeed do we grow our capacity to face disorientation and do the work of reorienting ourselves towards what we yearn for, what we can envision this world to be? I wonder, what do I need to be resourced enough internally and externally to allow the layers of protection I cling to slowly peel away? And what can I offer? What do others need from me to be resourced enough internally and externally to allow the layers of protection they cling to slowly peel away? We cannot protect and grow at the same time. In order to learn from experience and grow together, like the fluid distinctions between dusk and night, between land and sea, we must expand the gradients between you and I, between us and them, risking disorientation. This does not mean we naively ignore our distinctions and our differences. This does not mean we give up the necessity of temporary protection. It means we are asked to come back again and again to the life-giving vulnerability of our porousness. How do or might you take a moment each day to feel into the strength of your vulnerability? What are the practices, the small and simple practices that allow you to live in the tension, conflict, connection, and beauty of being here together? The practices that illuminate the liminal space between us, that don't just point out our porousness, but revel in it, explore it, wonder at it, love it, until we come to our knees in grief and gratitude for one another. May we envision and live into such practices and ways of being together. May it be so, and amen.